Our first scripture reading is from Numbers 21, 4 through 9. Listen now for a word from God. From Mount Or, the Israelites set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, but the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest this miserable food. Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole. And whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. Our gospel reading is from John 3, 14 to 21. And just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the human one be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have life beyond this age. For in this way, God loved the world, that God gave God's only child, so that everyone who trusts in the child may not perish, but may have life beyond this age. Indeed, God did not send the child into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through the child. Those who believe in the child are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already because they have not believed in the name of the only child of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen that their deeds have been done in God. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Betty Ann. Pray with me, friends. God, we know that you are here in this place. We believe that you are living and breathing in us and through us. So help us now to see you, to connect, to hear your voice. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So I imagine that most of you can relate to the idea that you find yourself in a conversation where you suddenly realize that you have no idea what's going on in the conversation, perhaps because you're thinking of something a little more interesting at the moment, or you just are totally distracted. Maybe you can think of a time when you were in school, back in those school days, your teacher calls on you and you realize you have no idea what's been going on in class. Or perhaps something a little more recent. You can think of a conversation that you've been having with your partner or your friend, and suddenly there's a pause and you realize the pause was for you to respond to something that your partner or friend said, but you don't know what you're responding to, really. You've missed the context for this moment. Or maybe, let's be real, it's in church. It's that moment when everyone else starts to stand up and you realize you're not even sure where we are in the service. It happens to all of us, friends. We all get distracted. We all find ourselves at places where we miss the context. Many of us have been in that place where we're not tracking the conversation. We're missing what's happening. And I imagine that for a lot of us, certainly those in this room, but also beyond this room, this is probably what it can feel like when we're engaging the biblical text. For instance, our gospel reading from today, John 3, contains one of the most famous verses in Christianity. John 3:16. For God so loved the world that God gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. When I hear this verse, the place I go to in my mind is a childhood Sunday school class when we did Bible memorization. This was like the baseline. It was like, if you didn't really get this verse memorized, you weren't even really a Christian. So you should think about your calling in life if you can't memorize this one. That's kind of how it was. But I think the reality is, reading this verse and memorizing it kind of felt like I was coming in on a conversation that I missed everything else that was talked about. And I was like, what's happening here? I don't really know what's going on. And I think that the sad thing is, this is often what happens in our churches, especially when we're reading these lectionary texts, right? It's kind of like we're just dropped into a text and we have no idea what's been happening in the conversation. It's just like, here you go. There's a serpent in the wilderness that's been lifted up, on a bronze serpent. And now everybody's healed. Oh my gosh, how exciting. Right? What is happening? Where do we go with these passages? What do we do with these stories? And perhaps today, I think an even bigger question is, what does Christianity even have to offer the world? Do we have something more than these stories that seem out of place, out of context? What is it that we have to give? Well, let's look at this question through the lens of John 3:16, since so many people do think it's so important. Some would even argue that it tells us all that we need to know about Christianity. So let's just pause for a moment and listen to it. I mean, it starts off pretty strong, right? It's about a God who loved the world so much that he, so first of all, he, it's apparently a male deity here that we're talking about, decided that it would be important to give up his only son. So this raises another question. How does God have a son? Are we talking like Zeus and Hercules here? I mean, what's going on here? And then here's the even stranger part. Whoever believes in this son is never going to die. What does that even mean? I mean, an initial reading makes it sound like the point of Christianity, if this is the zenith of our Christianity, it makes it sound like the whole point of this thing is for us not to die. Which, if that's the case, then maybe we should be listening to our evangelical siblings a little more. They seem to be on to that point. But what does it mean to never die then? What does this child of God have to do with never dying? And how will believing in that child make any difference whether or not we live or die? If this is what Christianity is really all about, I would say my assessment is it's a little too eccentric for me, and it's uncomfortable and irrelevant. For one, the verse makes it seem like we need to call Child Protective Services on this male deity, because if he is in fact giving up his child or killing his child so that everyone else can live, I think that's a little problematic. And I think the second thing is, how does belief in the Son make any difference? Is it magic? If we say the right words, if we have the right beliefs, does something suddenly change? And if so, what does change? How do we measure this change? You see, we become so familiar with these verses, we become so familiar with these stories, with the Christian story at large. We recite liturgies all the time. We sing songs that proclaim these same words all the time. And yet our familiarity makes us unaware of what it is we seem to be saying. It also can be so disconnected. It can be as if we say one thing but have no idea what we're saying, right? It's a dissociative act, we might call it in psychology. And it's no wonder that people might come to church and say, this isn't really for me. This seems irrelevant. I'm not sure why we're talking about death and blood and believing in some person. So back to our question then, what is it that Christianity is offering the world? Because if it's this sadistic patriarchal deity who sacrifices his only child so we can live forever, I'm not sure that that's really worth us pushing forward. Maybe for you. But if you haven't guessed by now, I mean, you probably have figured this out long before this. But that's not really my answer to the question of what Christianity is offering the world. And I think if we are really up to wrestling with this question, we're going to have to learn to listen to the conversation that comes before this verse. You have to learn to hear the whole context of these stories, to ask hard questions, and to really listen, not just to the conversations happening back then, but also to the conversations happening right now in front of us. What are people saying? What is it that they need? So let's set the stage for this verse then. We know from last week's gospel reading, we were in John chapter 2 last week, that Jesus was not exactly friends with the religious establishment. He wasn't really well liked by them, and I don't think that he seemed to like them very much either. And you can imagine that his temple protests did not really do much to advance his friendship with them. Yet, there is one leader of this establishment, an ecclesiastical leader by the name of Nicodemus, who does seek Jesus out. So this is how John 3 starts. Nicodemus does come to Jesus, and he does that at night. He is trying to be secretive, right? He's not trying to be out in the open in the daylight, meeting Jesus in person. He comes to him in secret to preserve his reputation. But Nicodemus does seem genuinely interested in Jesus. He starts off by affirming Jesus. He recognizes that, yeah, sure, Jesus, I get it. You're outside of the authority. You're not ordained by us. You don't have the ecclesiastical stamp of approval. But you do seem to have a real connection with God. You seem to be doing God's work in the world, Jesus. This is what Nicodemus comes to Jesus saying. And Jesus is like, so let's get to the point, Nicodemus. It's nice that you think that, but I don't really care what you think. Let's talk about why you're actually here. And at the end of the day, Jesus says to Nicodemus, you can't really experience the realm of God that I'm talking about with being born anew. Another translation would be born again or born from above. So again, another famous line that we hear Christians say all the time, born again. So this sparks a back and forth conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus. The problem here is that Nicodemus is speaking literally, and Jesus is speaking mystically. The writers of the dialogue are actually writing from a Jewish mysticism perspective. So they are thinking about how does it sound for them to talk about mystical things and how people hear them literally. And Nicodemus and Jesus's conversation is a prime example of this. And in case you don't know, whenever we're dealing with mysticism, we have to leave literalism by the wayside. Of course, as Nicodemus correctly observes, if he were to hear Jesus literally, his objection is true. We cannot literally re-enter the womb and be born again, Jesus. That's what Nicodemus says to him. My mama ain't gonna birth me again. I'm a full-grown human. This ain't gonna happen. So what is Jesus actually talking about then? Well, if we listen to the words of Episcopal Bishop Spong, Jesus is saying this: you must enter a transformative experience. You must see with insight or second sight. You must open yourself to a totally new perspective. Unless you are willing to escape your self-imposed boundaries, you will not believe this new vision for humanity. So the dialogue takes a turn here. Jesus appeals to that first passage that Betty Ann read for us today, the passage from Numbers. Just as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent, which, by the way, if you're looking at the cover of the bulletin, that is a statue of the bronze serpent. And if you didn't know, that's still the image that we use for medicine today, for healing. So that's where that image comes from. But just as Moses lifted up this bronze serpent in the statue, people looked to it and they were healed. So too, Jesus says, must the human one be lifted up. And we can presume that the idea would also be for some kind of healing. But this time, it's not just for a few ancient Israelites who have been bitten by poisonous snakes. This time it seems to be much, much broader. It seems to be for the entirety of humanity. So this is the conversation that sets the stage for John 3:16. It's a conversation that is essentially about a new vision for humanity, a humanity that finds healing by entering into a transformative experience in which our actual minds and our hearts are opened to recognize things that we did not recognize before. You see, a lot of us were able to name things. We're able to name things with our minds to say, this is true. But that's not what believe really means in this context. Believe in their minds meant trust, to lean into something with your whole self, to really trust that you are the beloved of God, that we are already part of God and God is part of us. In the words of John's Gospel, that the Word has already been made flesh. And if that is the case, if God is the ground of our reality, if we are already in God and God in us, then healing is available. That the way the world is does not have to be the way the world will always be, but that we have the capacity to recognize, to honor the sacredness that is inherent in the human experience. So what does Christianity have to offer the world? Well, if we're looking at John's Gospel, we might say a few things. We might say that Christianity has to offer us the realization, the understanding that the human experience is sacred. It is divine. It is to be honored, to be cherished. That we get to lean into the fullness of our humanity in its diversity and complexity and all that it is. And the writers of this gospel, they first recognized this message in Jesus. And they saw Jesus as someone who was guiding them towards wholeness, towards healing. They were people who, because of the way that they believed in Jesus, the way that they trusted Jesus to lead them towards wholeness, were eventually enemies also of the religious establishment. Eventually, the religious establishment kicked this community out. And even when they pushed them out, though, this community still said, listen, we're still going to look to the one who was lifted up. Because when we look at him, we remember who we are. What they are essentially saying is that there's no religious establishment that has the final say about our worth or our value. We are sacred all on our own. We don't need you to tell us that, because we have already been invited on a journey to continue to uncover just how sacred we really are, to really see how divine the world is already. Bishop Spong puts it this way. He says, this gospel is not about God becoming human. It's not about God putting on flesh and masquerading as a human being in Jesus. What it is about, though, is the divine appearing in the human and calling the human to a new understanding of what divinity means. And it is about bringing God out of the sky and redefining God as the ultimate dimension of the human. It is about the spirit transcending the limits of the flesh, not in some pious or religious sense, but in opening the flesh to all that it means to be human. It is about seeing Jesus as the doorway into a new consciousness, which is also a doorway into God, who might be perceived as a universal consciousness. So friends, at the end of the day, it's a lot of words to say this, that the good news that we are here to proclaim, what we are here to offer, is to remind people that we have seen in Jesus that we are sacred, period. End of the day. That's all that we are. Sacred, beloved, enough, loved, good. And when we can own that, when we can take that, we can see that operating out of our goodness leads us to dream of a new world that is more beautiful than we ever could have known before. And that's what we're offering. Pray with me. Spirit, help us to see the goodness of our humanity. Help us to see that we are loved and we are enough already. That in you, we can make something good and new and beautiful and right and true. Help us to see the great gravity of your love, that we are already embraced by you.